to hit the record button. Happy to have you. Happy to have Dr. Henry share with me in this class as well. And I want to give her a special welcome because I know her presence is going to make this class that much more engaging. And we will be together exploring so much about servant leadership. So welcome to all of you. And as we begin, I want to just make available on screen the agenda for our time together today. The main aspect of our time together is to listen to Dr. Henry as she presents to us a lecture with our first week of servant leadership, introducing us to the concepts and bringing our focus to a point where we really want to begin. But before I hand over to her, I want to just quickly go through with you some of the expectations that we have of you. I am happy that most of you are already familiar with the BGU regime. You are already in class or have done other classes, and so I need not spend a lot of time talking to you or introducing to you aspects of BGU's requirement. I just need to speak to you briefly about our expectations of you and what could be your expectations of us, and at the same time give you an opportunity to ask any questions for which you're not clear. And for some unknown reason, I'm not getting the agenda up as quickly as I want to. So I'm again going to attempt to share my screen and find it for you. Each time I bring it up, it disappears. Show all windows. So it's hidden somewhere here. Okay, here we go. Alrighty. I want to start first of all with the syllabus and ask each of you to read your syllabus carefully. Ensure that you are familiar with the dates that your final paper is due. Be familiar with the requirements as it relates to your book reviews. You've heard this over and over again from me. For some of you, you are tired of hearing it by now, but follow closely the instructions and ensure that you're delivering on time. We understand adult learning and we know that you will have exigencies that will take you away from delivery at times. What we would appreciate is that you would communicate with us when you are challenged in that way, and more importantly, communicate with your group too, because you're doing things together. Let's say, use an example. We ask you to respond to the initial discussion by Wednesday. And we do that with a purpose, because if you do that on Sunday, you do not allow the rest of the group to benefit from your participation, and you do not benefit from their response because you'd have gone to the close of the week. All right, so timeliness is important, very important, if you are not just taking care of your needs, but being particularly careful to contribute to others. So follow the things to do. The first thing I advise all our students to do as early as possible to Monday morning is to look at your list of things to do and ensure that you are careful to note what you must do by when and with whom in the event it's a group assignment, and get going to have it done as quickly as possible. One of the things that you will find a little bit more interesting and intriguing in this particular course is that we've introduced a lot of articles, journal articles, or latest conversations around the subject. And we're encouraging you to read widely. We know that you have your text, but your text is written and is static at the particular point in time when the discourse was taking place. Now, and even next week, there will be writings and articles that will contribute to how you see, think, and feel about servant leadership. And it is not so much so that you're regurgitating as much as you're considering the conversation and you are arriving at how you can apply this concept to your world, to your activity, and how you can add to the dialogue. So I'm encouraging you to read these articles and to go beyond that, because oftentimes one article gives you the source of several other articles that it considered in writing, and it may have cited in its writing, so that you may be able to pick up on other things that you're interested in. Grading rubric. That is also posted in the classroom on your information page. And what we want to do here is to give you an idea of what we consider when we're looking at the grade to which your particular assignment is given. It also guides you in determining how you write. So when you approach an assignment, it is not just what you think ought to be there, but please consider as well what we think you ought to be considering, because hopefully together we would have a complete, or at least a near to complete idea of how you should be looking at the 360 degrees as against your 180 that comes from your purview, right? We do a Zoom meeting each week, and I was saying earlier to OG, this Zoom meeting is intended to hear from you, clarify for you, and to bring you another perspective. Dr. Henry this week is going to be delivering an introductory lecture that speaks to how we consider servant leadership. And as we go along, we will have other lectures, we will have discussions. Sometimes you may well be the persons who are contributing to the Zoom meeting, especially as we get closer to the end of the project, when we want to hear from you. So we want to be consistent, so you take your Wednesdays as much as possible. But in terms of the time in which we do this, the time may vary, so that we ensure that whereas Brian, for example, is only listening in on his phone at this point, he can be physically present and may be able to participate in a more active way. I'm doing this very quickly because I want to hand over to Dr. Henry shortly. But one of the things I skipped was to have allowed you to briefly introduce yourself, the three of you who are here with us, And so I'm going to do that in probably the shortest sentence and most exciting that you can present about you and your expectation of the course. And if you do have a question, this would be a time to do so. So OG, I came and I met you. I'm anxious to know how you pronounce your name. So from Manchester in England, let us listen to you first. A very short sentence about yourself. I know that by today, everyone would have done the long version of their introduction in the classroom, and we will read a lot about that. So we're just taking the abridged version now, just so that we're familiar with each other as we go into the session. So I'm going to be saying OG. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your name, but let us hear it.
All right, my name is Olusegun Gbolagun, and I think it's easy to pronounce. Just follow it that way, Olusegun Gbolagun. Yeah, so it's gonna be easy. Yeah.
Okay.
So I live in Manchester here, but I'm from Nigeria. Came to England last year because my wife is here doing her PhD in English literature in Manchester here. So we considered that we should be together with our two boys. We've been married for 13 years and we have two boys. I was teaching in Nigeria, and then I'm doing a teaching assistant work here because I may not be able to teach until I get qualified to be able to teach the English curriculum. So that's why I'm here in England. And I've been doing, I started the DTL, I think 3 years ago, but I had to stop because of some logistics reasons and financial reasons. So, but I'm resuming now with servant leadership. And I'm excited to know more about servant leadership because the one we have known, we've studied with Dr. Reggie was transformational leadership. Although I've read a book partly about the servant leadership, the Green Leaf, but I have not thoroughly studied it. So I'm looking forward to more.
Thank you. Brian, are you able to speak? Should I just skip you and move along, or can you say something?
Yes, ma'am. Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I live in Douglasville, Georgia, which is about 25 miles from Atlanta. I am retired Army. I did 30 years active duty, so I recently retired. Right now, I'm working as a government contractor. I've been married for 6 years. I have one grown son who's 24. And my expectations for this course, I'm looking to see the other side of leadership, for lack of a better term. I'm fully exposed to the military side, so I think I'm lacking in other aspects of leadership perspectives. So that's what I'm looking to gain from this course.
Thank you, Brian. Reverend Sims, would you unmute and just give us your one sentence?
Eldred Sims, married 25 years, 2 children, 9 grandchildren, executive pastor, Living Hope Bible Church. I wasn't, let me see how I want to say this. I was hesitant in taking the class. I've got 3 to 4 vacations planned, and I know the sacrifice is needed. And I've been really reluctant to call Sister Mother McKenzie, and because I know what she's going to tell me when I talk with her. So after being, matter of fact, I'm wrapping up my last class now. I'm finishing my last piece of information. I did an extension, so I had to put in my reflection journals, and then I'm through with Dr. Peabody. It was a very, very good class. So that's where I'm at. And so I'm sure we'll talk afterwards. And this I will say one thing, Dr. Henry, and I hope I said this in the correct way. You are the very first woman of minority that's a doctor that I've had for a professor in any of my teachings, from the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh to seminary school at a master's college, and also at Golden Gate Seminary, Golden Gate Baptist Seminary, which is now Gateway. You are the very first woman of color at a doctorate level. And so now that's putting heat and pressure on me not to bag out, because I'm excited from what I'm seeing here. So I thank God for that with all that's happening. And you know, Sister Mackenzie, you know how I feel about you. And you are the one who have kept me in the program when I was ready to just pull out at the first class, because I'm like, you know, I really don't have to do this and we're good. So I thank God for you. But that's where I'm at. That's my history. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Sims. If I knew that the minority doctorate was so important to you, I would have told you. But know that I'm glad that Dr. Henry is here with me, even for more reasons. But thank you.
Yes.
I have been playing. I want to see myself more as journeying alongside of you than anything else. And so I'm sitting here in Jamaica and I'm looking out at the lovely blue seas. It's a nice, lovely day. And I'm happy to be here with you in this class. And let's go and hand over to Dr. Henry.
Thank you, Dr. Mackenzie, and thank you for welcoming me to this class. I will just briefly say who I am in terms of what I do here at Baki. Currently, one of the responsibilities I have is that I have been developing the PhD program in leadership. So I am the curriculum designer, and I have also worked with a subcommittee that has developed the Women in Leadership track. I just completed teaching a course in that track, programs that empower women, and in the fall, I will be teaching the course, Mentoring Women in the Professions. I'm excited that Baki decided to put in place a program that specifically addresses women and women's issues, especially in the context of leadership. I have had much of my experience in the field of education. My doctorate is in adult education administration, and alongside that, I have had a variety of experiences, not only as an adult education teacher, but as an administrator. I have been a dean of students, an academic dean, and a principal in the context of the Bible College and Christian higher education. So that is a little bit of my background. I'm also very involved in my local church. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, and I'm also responsible for developing curriculum for our educational programs. One of the things that I deeply appreciate about my local church is that we have a big vision. So there's a great emphasis on global missions. This year, we did a little change because we decided that since we spend so much time traveling overseas, teaching, etc., we needed to pay attention to the immediate community of which we are a part. So this last week, 2 weekends ago, and it was the hottest weekend ever, we had a community outreach Saturday and Sunday out in the open. It was exciting, but it was way too hot for people like me. And some of you might be amused by that because I am from the Caribbean, so I know about hot. But New York hot, I live in New York, is quite hot. I'm excited to join you here in this course on servant leadership. I find the concept and the issue and the interest in servant leadership quite intriguing and exciting. To begin with, I was introduced to the concept of leadership as an academic when I did my graduate studies at Wheaton College Graduate School several years ago. Believe servant leadership. For me, reading Greenleaf Servant put concepts, experience that I was very familiar with as a Christian, because I think deeply embedded in the Christian faith is a concept of servant leadership, because Jesus himself has been and still is the greatest example. Who is a servant leader and what is the meaning of servant leadership? So for me, I was intrigued by it, that it was now an academic study when, as a Christian, and that is paying commendation to the people who discipled me and taught me as a young Christian. That concept had already been quite embedded in my understanding of who I am and who I'm expected to be as a Christian. So it is from that perspective that I come to share with you on this journey of understanding and following and applying the concept of servant leadership. I thought that it would be good for us, for our first class, to look at servant leadership from the academic perspective, not discounting, certainly not discounting ever, the spiritual of servant leadership, because that is who we are as Christians. But I thought it was important for us to start with looking at servant leadership as a theory, because if we're going to study and test servant leadership, we're going to have to first understand it as a theory. Because when we do research, when we test on the basis of the theoretical model. So I'm going to give you an introduction to this. I'll share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will have Dr. Mackenzie put in the course when we're done. So let me get to that. Okay, let me do it. I would like to present it to you as a PowerPoint. Okay, slideshow. Okay, introduction to theories of servant leadership. And what is theory? I thought it best to start with unpacking the concept of the theory. Theory explains how some aspect of human behavior or performance is organized. It thus enables us to make predictions about that behavior. A definition of a theory is that it is a set of interrelated concepts, definitions, and propositions that explain or predict events or situations by specifying the relationships among variables. I know that is a lot to unpack, and what I will do is, when you have a chance to read the PowerPoint presentation, if you have questions, specific questions, and you can put it on the dashboard. I'll be happy to interact with you. But just giving you a brief and perhaps too quick overview. The components of theory. Theories, the two components of a theory are what we call concepts and principles. A concept is a symbolic representation of an actual thing. For example, tree, computer, table, those are concepts. A construct is a word for concepts with no physical referent. So then, servant leadership is a construct. A principle expresses the relationship between two or more concepts or constructs. So if we were to look at servant leadership and leadership, there is a relationship between those two concepts. First of all, there is servant and there's leadership. And servant leadership represents a construct by itself, but then leadership also represents a construct by itself. And we will see that much of the literature that we read on servant leadership tend to focus on servant leadership in relationship to leadership, and that's fine. However, when we look at especially the work of Greenleaf, and we also look at servant leadership as it is defined and described in the Bible, servant leadership is really at its root a philosophy. It's an approach that is then worked out in terms of behavior. And what I fear sometimes as I hear people talk about servant leadership and discuss it and reference themselves as servant leaders, etc., I fear sometimes that what we do is we dilute the deep philosophical meaning of the concept of servant leadership. And for those of us who are Christians, I would hope that we are protected from that. Every Jesus embodiment of the servant leader, because inherent in him is first his character, which is worked out in his relationship with others. The relationship between the concepts, between what we call a concept, a principle, and a theory. So I have identified first concepts and theory, principles, and then theory. The concepts and principles help us understand and explain what is going on. They also help us predict future events, so they can be either causal or correlational. Going back to the issue of servant leadership, within the context of leadership, one may ask the question, what kind of context will predict or cause to come to the fore a servant leader? What kind of organizational context? I go back again to the church. It seems to me that if we took seriously the teachings of Jesus and the biblical teachings, we would have to say that ideally, to be a Christian leader should mean that you are a servant leader. And notice I use the word ideally, because unfortunately, that ideal is just in several instances an ideal. We would be amiss to assume that because a person is a Christian in leadership position, that that person is necessarily a servant leader. My hope would be that for all of us and for each of us, our goal would be, from a Christian perspective, which of course will flow into all our other relationships, that at the heart of our service or at the heart of our leadership would be service characterized by servanthood. A theory is a related set of concepts and principles. It's about a phenomenon, and the purpose of the theory is to explain or to predict phenomenon. The importance of theory. Theories provide concepts to name what we observe. They allow us to explain what we see. They enhance the growth of the professional area to identify a body of knowledge with theories, both within and without the area of study. Theories help us understand what we don't know. So from an academic perspective, if we're going to study human behavior, etc., we start first with a definition and an understanding of the theories underlying human behavior. The development of theories. There are 3 stages of theory development in any new science. There is first the speculative, then there's the descriptive and the constructive. In terms of the speculative, we attempt to explain what is happening. Descriptive is where we gather data to describe what is happening. And constructive is when we revise old theories and develop new ones based on continuing research. What we see happening when we look at the theory of servant leadership is that, as we will note later, the theory of servant leadership is as old as humankind. That concept, it's always been there. It is embedded, it is rooted in the Christian faith, but it is not necessarily unique to the Christian faith. However, it wasn't until around 1977 when Greenleaf wrote his work, I think the first publication may have been 1973, on servant leadership, that we have had this explosion of interest in the theory and practice of servant leadership. But the concept has always been with us. So I've identified the sources for that section of my presentation, and we know that is always important in any work that we do, that we identify our sources. The next section, I'm looking specifically at one of the readings for the course, the one by Paris and Preachy, where they have looked at the literature, the research literature on servant leadership theory. And so we start with what we call the theory development process. How do we develop a theory? There is the concept of the link between theory, practice, theory. In some circles, we call it praxis. And what we are basically saying is much of what we do, if not all of what we do, our behavior, is rooted in theory. Sometimes that theory is explicit, but one of the things we need to be able to do from an academic and professional and practical standpoint is to be able to identify implicit theory. Because much of human life, encounters, etc., is rooted in theory. And I say that because unfortunately, for some people, especially for some people within the Christian tradition, there seems to be a divide between theory and practice. And oftentimes, people either put down or ignore theory, and they say, well, you know, this person is very theoretical, and that isn't usually not used as a compliment, because the assumption is that if you are theoretical, you can't be practical. And there is nothing farther from the truth, because embedded in practice is theory. And a good practitioner is one who is able to identify the theory or theories behind his or her practice, whether it is your practitioner within the church or outside of the church. Then there is the practice research theory combination, where you start with practice, you study it, you research it, and then you develop a theory to describe, to identify your practice. So we see what is happening in the organization, in organizational leadership. We submit it to research, and then we develop a theory from the results. And then there's the combination of theory, research theory. Your practice is built on initial theory. You develop a second theory, then you apply and test it. Servant leadership in organizational context. That's our source for this section of the presentation. And we've referenced already Greenleaf's work. The thing about it is that Greenleaf's work is at the heart of it. It's a philosophical piece. Servant leadership is a philosophy as described by Greenleaf. Greenleaf himself said that it was meant to be neither a scholarly treatise nor a how-to manual. He himself knew that he was making a philosophical statement when he wrote the text on servant leadership. Nevertheless, philosophy is applied to practice. And what happened is that because of his work with AT&T and the way he applied that work, that philosophy of servant leadership to AT&T and saw success, his book became popular, and it opened the doors for him to serve and to lecture and to consult with several organizations who were intrigued by the power of servant leadership to benefit organizations. The purpose of the study that I'm referencing here, that is Paris and Peachy's work, was to provide insight into how researchers have attempted to operationalize servant leadership based upon the evidence in published peer-reviewed journals of empirical studies conducted on servant leadership theory in organizational settings. One of the results of the popularization of the theory of servant leadership by Greenleaf is that we now have a vast amount of scholarship and literature that has addressed the theory of servant leadership. And we will see the different contexts in which servant leadership has been studied. The research questions of this, what we would describe as a review of the literature, the research literature, and the scholarship on servant leadership. There were 4 basic research questions. How was servant leadership defined? In what context was servant leadership empirically investigated? How was servant leadership examined? That is the methodology of the studies. And what were the results of the examination? The origins of servant leadership, the work of Greenleaf. The contemporary study of servant leadership evolved largely from his work. The practice of servant leadership, as I said earlier, is not a new concept. The roots dating back to ancient teachings of the world's great religions, as well as to statements of numerous great leaders and thinkers. There are 3 streams of research that have looked at the theory of servant leadership. Servant leadership as a concept, the measurement stream, and model development. The measurement stream, there we're looking at how do we measure for servant leadership. If we are saying that somebody is a servant leader of it, or if we're saying that an organization is committed to servant leadership, how do we measure for that? How do we know that? There has to be objective measurement for that. And then the model development is when we, having committed to the concept and the measurement, there are some people who are proposing that there is a model that we could follow to get to servant leadership. And one of our texts, let me see if I can put mine up, is an example of that model development. Just a minute. Okay, there's 7 pillars of servant leadership, which is one of the texts that we're reading. To my mind, it represents a model that the writers propose that we could follow in order to attain to servant leadership. The conceptual stream, we look, when we look at servant leadership as a concept, we look at its attributes, or its the operative qualities and distinctive characteristics of servant leaders. I would suggest that much of the research and writings that we see on servant leadership focus on this area of it, and it's the attributes. So the conceptual stream is pretty strong in terms of the literature. Attributes of the servant leadership, that is within the concept, the conceptual stream, and we see a lot of that. There are 9 functional attributes that this research unpacked. Vision, honesty, integrity, trust, service, modeling, pioneering, appreciation of others, empowerment. And then the accompanying attributes here: communication, credibility, competence, stewardship, visibility, influence, persuasion, listening, encouragement, teaching, delegation. So the attributes of servant leadership are well documented and studied. And I would suggest to you that not only the 7 pillars, but certainly the 7 pillars references attributes. Findings, the findings of Peachy, they found that servant leadership theory remains underdefined with no consensus on its definition or theoretical framework. There are different attributes perceived to make up servant leadership, but they are not weighed equally, and this is the piece that is of interest to me, across cultures. So yes, servant leadership is a global concept. However, in terms of measures and attributes, some attributes are not weighed in the same way in certain cultures. Studies support the notion that servant leadership can improve followers' well-being. And servant leadership is applicable in a variety of cultures, contexts, and organizational settings. The context of the studies reported, and as we could well guess, servant leadership is studied across several different organizations, especially popular in the field of leadership, education, business, psychology, nursing, management, sales and selling. AT&T would be about sales and selling, ethics, parks and recreation, administration. There are 7 research teams that emerged from this study that is reported here. The cross-cultural applicability of servant leadership attributes, the team level of effectiveness, followers' well-being, spirituality, demographics, and the implementation of servant leadership construct. So if you are thinking in terms of doing research, your dissertation in this area, the field is wide open to you in terms of where you can go with it. And the research recommends, and any piece of good research always recommends further studies. It recommends studies in two areas: the antecedents of servant leadership development and the outcomes of servant leadership development. In terms of the antecedents, the personal attributes of the leader, the background of the leader, and the organizational history and trajectory. So we are suggesting that there are prior situations that may foster or explain the emergence of a servant leader. Personal attributes, background, and the history of the organization in which he or she is involved. And then in terms of outcomes of servant leadership, we look at voluntary organizational turnover, succession planning, effective organizational commitment, employee well-being through generative growth. So these are some areas of possible study as we move forward in the field of servant leadership. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. What did not come up here was I do have, and I think it came up earlier, the references section. Yes, the sources. That should have been at the end. But these are the sources I use for this presentation. I am aware that I probably spoke a little too fast, but I'll give you a chance to ask questions. And the PowerPoint is going to be in the course, so you'll have a chance to look at it and take your time over it. But any questions or comments on what I have shared?
I have no questions. Well, I do have a question. Are you a ordained preacher?
No, I'm not.
Why not?
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I need not say no more.
Yes. If I may confess, that's not a good thing to confess. I have been invited to do that a very long time ago, but that I have not felt that that was where God was leading me. But I do ministry and I teach and preach, so.
Well, yeah, you did some of that today, so there's no question. That's why I asked the question.
Okay, okay.
Last Sunday when I preached, I just preached this past Sunday, and I was talking about in 1 Thessalonians how he talked about work of faith, labor of love, and patience of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And in that is talking in regards to servants. People are not serving. And I brought to the table, if you truly love the Lord, how is it that only 20% of the people in the church are doing 80% of the work if you're truly committed to Christ?
Sure.
You truly have a passion for him. So when you were speaking, it took me back to that sermon as I really broke down what it means to have a work of faith versus faith in your work. It's two different concepts. One, God gets to praise, the other one, you get to praise. And so it just came to me. This is very good. I'm going to need to look over it and go through it. And after that, I'm sure I'm going to have some questions because the concept of the theory and the philosophy, I need to play with a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Claire, let me just thank you too for this presentation and the way in which it evoked certain thoughts in me. I know that one of the most quoted phrase from Greenleaf is the idea of those whom we serve becoming greater, bigger, better, healthier, and all of those adjectives than we are.
Yes.
And that in itself, I wondered, as we begin to look at theory and we begin to look at research, if in your review you found any focus. I noticed that in this particular study, it did allude to the fact that we could spend more time looking at the outcome of those who are served. If I'm not remembering the specific phrase, I think I was writing it down. But I wondered how much we had managed to, as if it were research, and affirm, confirm, prove that the process, when it is engaged, does produce that specific results. Those beneficiary of service really being empowered to become better leaders than the leaders who have served them. I asked that question because I want so badly to achieve that result in the lives of whom I've come to impact. I think it's the theory on which we could say we want to leave the world a better place.
Okay.
Because if those who we serve do not become bigger and better than we are, in the context where big does not mean, you know, the usual, then we don't leave the world a better place.
Okay.
What has research shown? Have you found anything that tried to test that?
Yes, actually, it's summed up here on the findings, and when you look at the article itself, they reference the specific research. The studies support the notion that servant leadership can improve followers' well-being.
Yes, and yeah, I saw that, and the idea of improving the well-being went over my head, because I was specifically reading into Greenleaf the idea of them becoming better leaders.
Yes, that is embedded in that.
Yes.
Yes. The research acknowledges that. So that article will show some of it. Definitely.
Okay, thank you. I really want to grab onto that some more and do some more work in that. But that was just from me. More importantly, is for you, our students, to be asking your questions. So please go ahead, should you have questions relating to this. And think in terms of how is this going to inform the way I approach servant leadership. And I hear you coming, Reverend Simpson. I'm going to give you an opportunity to, but how do I approach it in this course? Is it going to be a theological discourse? Are we going to be looking seriously at the ways in which, the broad dimension in which it can be used? So I'm not the pastor of a church. How do my incorporating and assessing and evaluating my servant leadership roles based on all the various concepts that we will be looking at as we go along? Because one of the things that this presentation is forcing us to do is to think seriously about the framework from all angles, and not necessarily singularly from the biblical angle. And that's a challenge, because in a lot of these servant leadership courses that I have had the privilege of leading, we tend to stay where we're comfortable. And we try to mold it into and make it. And interestingly, Greenleaf may have been totally influenced by a religious conceptualization, and he actually aligned a lot of what he had to say as if we could assign a scripture to it. But he wanted to, AT&T or wherever, right, to make this a concept that could find a theory, could be tested, could be researched, and developed into a model of leadership. So my input, but go ahead. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, you know, the Bible is something, and life is something. When you look at the life of the Greek, you look at the life of the Jews, you look at the life of the Gentiles. This second point here is for me, is the separating and the dividing factor. Different attributes perceived to make up servant leadership are not weighed equally across cultures. So as an example, our congregation, we have 80% of our congregation is Black. We founded another church, and we have a Hispanic pastor by the name of Juan Romero. And 100% of that congregation is Mexicans. Their culture, if I tried to, at one time we said we were going to have service with everybody on Sunday, for every first Sunday. That will not work. And the reason it won't work is because the difference in the cultures in regards to their leadership and their priorities and what they value and where they come from. And under servant leadership, you have to find that, for lack of term, that happy medium for their culture where they feel they can grow and they can expand. If I bring them to, for lack of a better term, the Black church, the music that's sang in the Black church, the prayers that are prayed, the concept of how we do things versus how they do things, it is day and night different. They don't understand our language. We don't understand their language. Although all of us are worshiping and praising God, what they weigh is important to them. Like on Sundays, they want to have dinner every Sunday after church. They want to bring in their food. They have activities that they want to do. We're as a Black church, we're not doing it. We'll do it every now and then. So this second point is key to me. And I asked myself, and so finally I made the decision. We do not need to have, we will have maybe 4 combined services a year, and that's it. Thanksgiving, certain holidays. But I've come to the conclusion that I have to let them be who they are, who God has called them to be, based on their culture. And we have to be who we are based on our culture. And the same thing with other cultures. That's why on Sunday mornings, it's segregated everywhere. You know, everybody go to their church, to their culture, to their beliefs and their philosophies and their theories, and they follow and stay with that. And I see that in the Bible. I definitely see it. When the Jews did not want to accept the Gentiles, I see that. I thank God that he sent Paul and said, this is what you will do, and let the Gentiles have access to the Lord. But that's a barrier there. That crossing over into other cultures, because when you go over, they want you to become them. They feel that their way is the right way, and they want, this is how we serve, this is how you got to do it. And if you want to change some things, then you need to go find a church to fit the changes that you want. So it's interesting. I love the second point because it's a definer for me. And I'm seeing that as an issue in the churches, and it's not just culturally. Sometimes you can be from the same culture, but your differences in theory is like day and night. With some of the teachings that some of these preachers are doing, I'm like, man, where did you get this from? And you know, in Corinthians, they're trying to mix up paganism, Judaism, Christianity. They pull on a little from everywhere. Okay, now we're going to put this together, and now this is the pie. So I'm off my soapbox, but I love that second point. That's an issue. I'm fighting with that right now.
Okay. Can we hear from Olusogun?
Yes. I think maybe my question is 1 and 2. I actually wrote in my submission for the discussion of the articles for the week, asking that there's a statement made by the people that wrote the article about the downside of both transformational leadership and servant leadership. That let me just say the statement that, but something like history is replete with people that have manipulated their followers in the name of servant leadership. Talking about the downside of servant leadership, most of the time I find it comfortable, or not comfortable really, but I understand quickly when I study individuals with theories, So I was asking in my submission that, okay, could there be examples of such individuals? Because maybe sometimes if we understand the negative, we may be able to gain an understanding of how to do it right. So I think that leads to my second question, because you're talking about the theory being developed systematically now. I am wondering if there are active professors working on this, the theory, developing the theory, empirically, so that if certain individuals are mentioned as being, prototype, accurate example of servant leadership, we will have empirical validation, to their examples.
Okay. To answer the first question in terms of leaders, and I saw your post there, examples of leaders who have abused these philosophies. History is replete. Yes, indeed. I don't know, have you heard of Jim Jones? Are you familiar?
Yes.
With Jim Jones?
Look at his followers, murdered.
Right. Okay. Well, unfortunately, perhaps I'm too familiar with him, because that incident occurred in my native country of Guyana.
Oh.
Now, Jim Jones, I've seen some of the documentaries, and I've read one of the books on him. He was your classic, what you may call your classic servant leader. Wow. The way he related to those people in his church. It was a church that originated here in the US.
Mm.
And he abused their trust.
Mm.
One of the outcomes of servant leadership is that you develop people's trust in you, right? Now, when people trust you, it is possible to abuse trust.
Mm.
Leaders always have to be careful that they do not abuse trust.
Mm.
So that's one example. There are many others that we could think of, but I know that one in terms of the history of it, etc. And it is a live history. In fact, every year CNN does a documentary on the Jim Jones situation. At least on CNN, I've seen it in other places. But that's one example. Sorry. Go ahead, Dr. McKenzie.
I want to be a little bit more provocative, Dr. Henry, because I remember, and OG, you actually brought the memory back so clearly in your first question. And I asked it in the opposite way. I think of my own country, Jamaica, and Dr. Henry would be familiar with that too. There are cultures where the word servant brings with it strong historical descent.
Mm-hmm.
In so much so, to get this message across, I feel the word serving with just the slightest variation in meaning has a psychological impact on how it is received. Because here is a people who have been brought across from Africa to the Caribbean as slaves. And they were introduced to the Christian religion by their slave masters, right? And the relationship was one of servitude. And the moment that I begin to do something for you that puts that view of serving you into my head. And so when I approached my first servant leadership class, I remember my first discussion response was the cultural impact of these two words. Not just the fact that they seem to be not words that fit, but the mental impact, all right? And how you will have a culture that will have to embrace Jesus and how he served, but understand that there are persons within my own culture that because I have served them, they cannot see me. Dr. Henry alluded to it, scholarship and practice, right? And so they will never acknowledge the scholar in me because they have embraced the servant in me. And so I can personally allude to the victimization or the narrowing of the views of those who, you know, I like to serve tables. I like to accommodate. I like to make you feel comfortable. I like to do the things that is associated with, you know, the lower class structure. I don't like offices and titles, so I may never tell you who I am in terms of a title. And I will avoid speaking about what I do in terms of the leader. But I have also experienced this, maybe on, you know, not even the conscious, but the subconscious disregard, because the servant is subconsciously disregarded. Leadership, now that's cultural. To a certain extent, it may go across many cultures in different ways. But I would dare to answer your question with that at the back of my mind, because I know that we have generations of persons in need of work who will not do it in our country. They may travel to United States and do more menial stuff, but they will not do it here. They would prefer to be unemployed for life because they're journeying with the thought that to do it is to be responding to the demands of the slave master hundreds of years after.
I think Older Sugun has a response to that.
Well, I was just saying to what Dr. the illustration she just gave, that, you know, people will not do some work in the work they will not do in Jamaica, they will go and do it in the United States. And that's the same thing I found when I came here to the United Kingdom. The jobs that, you know, people will not do back in Nigeria, they gladly do it here, you know, maybe because of the pounds. And then when you compare pounds with Naira, our currency, it makes sense to do that here, and not because nobody is looking at them. And then they do it not because of the service, They do it because, okay, the earnings that will come from it. So I was just alluding to what she said.
Okay, you are agreeing with her.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brian, do you have any question or observation? Can you?
Yeah, I apologize, ma'am. I have been listening in. I have been glancing at the notes. I'll probably need to take it home and digest it tonight. And if I have any questions, I would definitely ask.
Sure. Any comments on the concept of servant leadership? Okay. Well, over to you, Dr. McKenzie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henry. This is really giving us some food for thought. It is also helping us to define our responses. Do not feel if you have already written a response this week that you cannot go back and add to or continue the dialogue based on just how we have been encouraged to look at servant leadership in terms of the theory, the research, the practice, and to even examine what phase are you in as you examine servant leadership yourself, right? And how can you do that cycle? Where do you begin? Which of the three operatives will you begin from? I have been challenged to do that. I want to see where I'm seated now, what phase I'm in, and how do you do that? And which would better fit the ongoing exploration of this subject, all right? Pay special attention to the citations. Pay special attention to the fact that this level of discourse is asking you and asking of all of us, not just to place on paper our initial response, but to be looking and reading the material that we have and think seriously about the response, citing where necessary that which is influencing that response. Okay, because that is when we begin to really not just pour out what we believe, but begin to learn because we're interrogating the perspectives of others. All right? So we will be looking at the questions. The other things is that if you have not yet entered the classroom, today is the day when you do so. That act of introducing yourself is an act of registration. It is saying, yes, I've signed on to servant leadership and I will be in class. It is as if you had walked into your physical class and you signed your name as being present, right? So I would love for those who are not here and who are listening, as well as you who are here, enter, introduce yourself, do the things you need to do by end of day today. And as we do so, we show respect to each other, as well as getting early. I did not mention that we have encouraged you to read the books based on the subject area we're covering. And so I'm going to be introducing to you the best fit books for the various weeks based on the areas we'll be exploring, so that that can guide your reading. I also encourage you to do your book reports on time, because in doing so, you're really lightening your weight for the final paper. If you wait until the end to do the journaling and the book reports, you might find that you're onto the due date and you're not yet ready. Okay, so this is going to be intense. We will be, as much as possible, researching and throwing. Dr. Henry has done quite a bit of research around current discourse on this subject. and has opened up a lot for us to look at. It would be a waste if we do not spend some time looking at it. Do not just see this course as an affirmation of our biblical context and do nothing else. Okay? It is in addition to and a vast body of knowledge in addition to. All right? I thank you so much, Dr. Henry, and I thank those of you who are present, and I trust that those of you who will be viewing the recording will be ready to throw your understanding, questions, research back at us, so that altogether we will be learning from each other.
Okay, thank you.
So, bless you. Goodbye. We get ready for the next session. Next week, Wednesday, we will tell you the time, and we will also be telling you more about what we will be meeting to do in a little while.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure being with you. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.